New commander is on duty. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces. Okay. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Do you copy?
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? On the ground.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Sniper! We got company. We got company overhead. Enemy aircraft.
Enemy armor spotted.
We got company. We got company overhead. Over.
We've regained control. Good work, man. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy aircraft. Enemy aircraft. Enemy troops.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Move out.
Hostile chopper. The enemy is in control. Work harder, soldiers. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Move out. Attack here.
Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostiles on the ground. Hostiles on the ground. Move out. Attack here. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostiles on the ground. Attack this position. Enemy activity. Do you copy?
Enemy forces
Over.
spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Attack this position. Enemy activity. Do you copy?
Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over.
Enemy infantry
Enemy
spotted.
armor spotted. Enemy tank is inbound.
Enemy
Over.
armor spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor spotted.
We got enemy tank inbound. Over. Enemy units on the move.
Enemy armor spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted. 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 Enemy armor spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile chopper over.
Online and transmitted.
Enemy aircraft. We got company overhead.
Spotted.
Hostile fleet
We've
inbound.
regained
Over.
control. Good work, man.
Hostile chopper
Enemy
identified.
sniper spotted.
Enemy aircraft.
Enemy forces spotted. 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 spotted.
Hostile chopper identified.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Move out. Attack here. Hostile on the road.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy infantry 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 spotted.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy sniper.
Enemy
Enemy
units on
sniper
the move.
spotted. Enemy car spotted.
Attack this position. Thanks. I owe you one.
UAV online.
Hostile forces spotted. Enemy air assets over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
UAV offline.
Hostile slick inbound.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile forces spotted.
UAV
Over.
transmitting on this mark.
Enemy air assets over. Enemy air assets over.
Enemy
hostile jet spotted.
Enemy forces spotted.
Over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. We've regained enemy control. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy enemy
Hostile chopper over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy aircraft. Hostile chopper over.
Enemy armor spotted.
Enemy helicopter spotted.
Enemy car spotted. Enemy helicopter is in control. Work harder, soldiers.
Transmitting on this mark.
We've regained control. Good work, men. Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile jet spotted. Over. Hostile jet
Enemy
spotted.
forces
Over.
spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor
Move
spotted.
out. Attack here.
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces 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 spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile chopper identified.
Enemy
Hostile chopper
infantry.
over.
Enemy infantry
Enemy units
spotted.
on the
Enemy
move.
infantry spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry over. Enemy infantry spotted.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy
UAV is bingo on fuel. Transmission ending.
Sorry! Enemy units on the move!
UAV online.
Snipers on our perimeter!
Enemy
Snipers on our
forces
perimeter!
spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted.
Hostile chopper,
Enemy
over. We got
aircraft.
company overhead! Over!
Enemy forces spotted.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy
Enemy
jets
aircraft.
spotted. Enemy forces
We got
spotted.
company
Enemy
overhead.
infantry
Spotted.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy cars spotted.
Enemy
Enemy
helicopter
infantry spotted.
Hey, thanks. Enemy aircraft! Okay. Hostile chopper identified.
Enemy sniper
Enemy
spotted.
enemy tree copy. Hostile slick inbound. Over.
Position clear. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy
Enemy
units on
forces
the move.
spotted.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Enemy infantry spotted.
We got company overhead. Over. No way, sir.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy cars spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy armor spotted.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
We've lost control of an outpost.
Requesting reinforcements. Over. Hey, thanks. We got company overhead. Over. We got company overhead. Snipers on our perimeter.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Attack this position.
UAV online and
Hey, thanks. Enemy
Enemy
aircraft.
forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy helicopter.
Chopper flight inbound. Over. Enemy forces spotted. Over.
Vehicle dropped in your sector.
Enemy
Enemy
troops.
infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
All clear.
Enemy forces
Position under
spotted.
control. Out. Enemy forces spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? Sniper. Enemy units on the move.
Enemy forces spotted. Forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy units on the move.
Enemy infantry.
No, sir.
Enemy sniper spotted.
Enemy units on the move. Okay.
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces.
Enemy units on the move.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Attack here.
Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy forces.
Enemy infantry.
spotted. Over. Enemy activity. Copy.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry
We got
spotted.
company overhead. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Spotted. Over. Spotted. Over. Hostile forces. Enemy troops. Enemy troops. Identified.
Your position. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Enemy troops.
Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile forces spotted. Enemy air. Enemy unit spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy forces.
Enemy helicopter spotted.
Enemy air assets
Over.
over.
Enemy infantry spotted. 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 Enemy infantry spotted.
Hey, thanks.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy car spotted. Cleared and under control.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Hostile jet spotted.
Enemy
Over.
infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Inbound.
Enemy
Over.
forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry
Enemy
spotted.
unit. Enemy unit. Enemy forces. Hostile chopper. Over. Enemy helicopter
forces
spotted.
spotted.
Enemy hostile chopper identified.
UAV offline.
Hostile chopper identified.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy forces. Over. Hostile
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy unit
Enemy
on the
forces
move.
spotted. Enemy jet spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy forces. Over. Enemy air assets. Over. Hostile infantry spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy aircraft.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile chopper. Over.
On this mark.
Hostile chopper.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy jet spotted.
Enemy forces. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile enemy spotted. Over. Hostile chopper. Over. Spotted.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy helicopter spotted.
Enemy armor spotted.
Over.
Enemy
air
infantry
assets.
spotted.
Over.
Enemy
Hostile jet spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile chopper. Hostile force identified. Over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy
troops
forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy
Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces. Enemy aircraft. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
enemy jet spotted.
Hostile infantry spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Artillery.
Infantry spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy
Enemy
troops
infantry
spotted.
spotted. Enemy infantry.
forces
Enemy
spotted.
forces
Over.
spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy
Enemy
helicopter
forces
spotted.
spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper
Enemy forces.
spotted.
Over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
Hostile chopper. Over. Hostile infantry spotted. infantry spotted.
Enemy
Over.
sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
I owe you one.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
Enemy air at. Enemy air at. Hostile jet spotted.
Enemy
Over.
infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
Enemy units on the move. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Supplies at your position. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy hostile forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces spotted.
Vehicle spotted. Over.
Hostile forces
forces.
Enemy
Vehicle
sniper
spotted.
spotted.
Over.
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy units on the move. Hostiles on the ground.
Enemy infantry spotted. Sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile forces. Enemy forces. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Hey.
Enemy sniper spotted.
Enemy forces.
Enemy sniper spotted.
Enemy units on the move.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry
Hostile
spotted.
infantry spotted. Over.
Transmitting on this line.
Enemy units on the move. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry. Enemy enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Sniper spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
Enemy units on the move.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy troops identified. You got it. Over.
UAV offline.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry
I owe you
spotted.
one.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy forces. Over. Spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy
troops
infantry. Enemy
identified.
sniper
You copy?
spotted.
Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry.
Enemy troops.
Transmitting on this line.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
Hostile forces spotted.
Alive in your position.
Enemy forces. Over. Good deal. Thanks. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostiles on the ground.
Transmitting on this line.
Hostile infantry spotted. Over.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Inbound. Over. Hostile forces. Hostile forces.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Over. Hostile chopper identified.
We've lost control of an outpost. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry.
Enemy air assets over. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostile forces spotted. Forces over. Sniper. Enemy units on the move.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile chopper identified. Medic to this
Enemy
position.
infantry
Over.
spotted.
Enemy forces.
Enemy forces.
Medic.
Enemy sniper
I owe
spotted.
you one.
Enemy forces
Enemy
spotted.
units on the move.
Enemy
units on
infantry.
the move. Enemy aircraft.
UAV is being low on fuel.
Enemy aircraft. Enemy aircraft.
Transmitting on this mark.
Enemy activity. Enemy activity. Medic to this
Enemy
position.
car
Over.
spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
Enemy vehicle. Enemy forces. Over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy
Requesting a
forces
medic.
spotted.
Over.
Position cleared and under control.
Enemy activity. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy air assets. Over. Requesting a medic. Over. Hostile jet spotted. Over. We got company overhead. Over.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Roger that. Enemy units on the move.
We've lost control of an outpost.
Enemy forces. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile chopper. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile split. Inbound. Over.
Enemy
Hostile
infantry
chopper.
spotted.
Over.
Transmitting on this mark.
Artillery, your area.
Enemy units. Enemy troops identified. Forces. Over. Enemy troops. Hostile forces spotted. Hostile forces spotted.
Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. 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 Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted.
Over. Enemy troops identified.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy car spotted. Hostiles on the ground. Hostile vehicle spotted. Over. Hostile vehicle spotted.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry
Enemy
spotted.
units on the move. Hostile infantry spotted. Over. Enemy units on the move.
Enemy
forces
infantry
over.
spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Overrun.
UAV transmitting on this
Enemy
mark.
infantry spotted.
Enemy forces over. Over. Enemy troops identified. Over. Requesting ammunition. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces. Enemy hostile chopper. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy troops. Enemy air assets. Over. Enemy units.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy
helicopter.
Enemy car spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy sniper spotted.
Hostile infantry spotted. Over.
On this mark.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy troops. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Hostile enemy force spotted. Over. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy troop. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostile forces spotted. Over.
UAV online.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile forces. Enemy troop.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Position cleared and under
Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy air forces.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Infantry spotted.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Enemy
Enemy
helicopter
car spotted.
spotted.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy
forces. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy snipers on our perimeter.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Spotted. Over. Enemy forces.
Enemy
Over.
infantry spotted.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostile forces.
Enemy infantry spotted. Forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy activity. Do you enemy activity? Do you copy?
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile forces.
Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy
forces. Enemy forces. Over.
Enemy forces
Enemy
spotted. Enemy
helicopter
forces
spotted.
spotted.
Hostile
Enemy
chopper.
forces
Over.
spotted.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Enemy forces. Over. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Over.
We've lost control of it. Enemy infantry spotted. Armored. Enemy infantry spotted.
Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile flick inbound. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
We're taking
Enemy car spotted.
Transmitting on this mark.
Hostile armor sighted. Over.
Enemy
armor
horse.
spotted.
Enemy helicopter spotted.
Enemy helicopter spotted.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces.
Enemy ammo. Enemy units.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy troop.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy activity. Do you copy?
Enemy forces.
Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Hostile armor sighted. Over.
On this mark.
Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Sniper. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy activity. Enemy units. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy forces. Over. Hostile jet spotted. Over. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces over. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile forces spotted. Enemy forces over.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy aircraft.
Enemy forces over. Enemy infantry spotted.
Spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy forces.
Enemy forces spotted.
Forces spotted. Over. Requesting ammunition. Over. Need ammo. Enemy forces. Over. I owe you one.
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper
Enemy
spotted.
helicopter
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
forces
Enemy
spotted.
sniper
Over.
spotted.
Thanks. I owe you one. Snipers on our perimeter. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Over. We need ammo.
Enemy infantry. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy vehicle.
Enemy car spotted.
Enemy forces.
Enemy
Over.
infantry.
We need ammo. Forces spotted.
Enemy
Over.
infantry.
Hostile forces spotted. Enemy forces. Over.
UAV transmitting on this one.
Enemy activity.
Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile infantry spotted. Over.
Enemy forces
Enemy
spotted.
troops
Enemy forces
identified.
spotted. Enemy forces
All clear.
Enemy forces
Hostile
spotted.
jet spotted. Over.
Enemy forces spotted.
Requesting ammunition. Over. Hostile jet spotted. Over.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy 44 enemy. Over. Hostile jet spotted. Over.
Enemy
Requesting ammunition. Over.
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile 40 troops identified. Do you copy?
Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile armor sighted. Over.
Transmitting on this one.
Requesting a medic.
Enemy forces
Over.
spotted.
Requesting
Enemy
ammunition.
forces
Over.
spotted.
Medic to this position. Over.
Enemy forces spotted.
We need ammo.
Enemy forces spotted.
Thanks. Hostile chopper identified. Hostile jet spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Vehicle dropped in your sector.
Enemy units on the move.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry.
Running low on
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Spotted.
Enemy aircraft.
Online.
We got company overhead. Over. Enemy
Enemy
aircraft.
forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy jet spotted.
We got company overhead. Over. All clear. Enemy forces over. Snipers on our
Flies
perimeter.
at your position.
We got company overhead. Over.
Enemy car spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor spotted.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy forces over. Okay. Requesting a medic. Over. Enemy troops identified. Do you copy? We got hostile armor.
Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor spotted.
Snipers on our perimeter.
Vehicle dropped in your sector. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy
over.
forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Over.